We have a lady here by the name of Stacey Fitzgerald. She is going to talk about her study, Persecution and Resistance of Polish Women in KL Ravensbruck. She's an independent filmmaker and producer from Atlanta, Georgia. Stacey, where are you at? There you are.
Thank you.
20 minutes.
Okay, can everybody hear me? You'll have to excuse my voice. I'm allergic to the fall, so I'll make it through it. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to share with you this true story about a group of young women in the Polish resistance and how they survived against all the odds in a concentration camp. But first, I want to show just a teaser of the film, just a short teaser, to give you a brief setup of the story and a glimpse of these amazing women of the resistance. So for me, my journey with this film really began about 30 years ago when I was visiting my grandmother in the isolated hills of northwest Alabama. My great-uncle John had stopped by to say hello, and the family was all gathered around the fireplace talking and telling stories. I was describing my first trip to Paris when my great-uncle John told me, much to my surprise, that he'd also been there. He had gone to Paris with Patton. He had rarely spoken about the war, and we thought we'd finally hear about Omaha Beach or the Battle of the Bulge. Instead, he told us about the worst experience of the war, about when he helped liberate a woman's concentration camp. After describing the horrors of the camp and the solidarity and strength of the women in the barracks, he asked me to promise that I would speak up and make sure that others knew what he had seen with his own two eyes. Many years later, excuse me, I met a writer, Martha Hall Kelly. She happened to be finalizing the first draft of what would eventually become the instant New York Times bestseller, Lilac Girls. Not yet. Her book was a work of historical fiction that was based on the true story of the rabbits. And had we seen that, you would know what the rabbits were. And they were young girls in the Polish resistance who were subjected to horrific experimental surgeries at the camp of Ravensbruck, or Ravensbruck, as we say here in the South. She held me spellbound that first evening, telling me the incredible story of the women who inspired her to write her first novel. And it was these women and the story that inspired me to search for the surviving rabbits and the women of the resistance who were with them in the camp. I wanted to have these women of the barracks tell us their story, a small piece of which I discovered my great-uncle and other American soldiers stumbled upon decades ago in war-torn Europe. With Martha's blessing and her Polish contacts, I was eventually able to find and interview 4 of the surviving rabbits: Wanda Potowska, Stasia Ojicko, Wanda Roshewicz, and Wojciech Zajska. Wojciech, the oldest of this group, would have been 20 when the Germans invaded Poland. The youngest, Stasia, would have just been 14. I was able to find and interview many other Polish Ravensbruck survivors, some of whom lived with the rabbits in the camp. I'd like to share with you what I learned from these women about how they resisted and by working together survived. It wasn't until I spoke with Stasia that I began to really understand. I'm gonna pull this down. I feel like I'm standing on my tiptoes. One second. It wasn't until I spoke with Stasia that I really began to understand the young women of the resistance who were on the September 1941 Lublin-Warsaw transport to Ravensbrück. Stasia, who sadly died a couple weeks after our interview, explained, "Mother and homeland, it became one, meaning for us truly, the most important thing was homeland and our mother. These were the 2 figures we created for ourselves that we loved most of all and for which we probably endured." These patriotic, devoutly Catholic girls, bound by their oath of God, honor, and country, were determined to always act in a way that brought honor to their homeland, their families, and their God. I discovered that this, for them, was the bedrock of their resistance. As Wanda Potowska kept reminding me, the Polish political prisoners knew why they were in the camp. It was a risk they willingly took when they joined the resistance. They were able to keep a sense of purpose, consciously resisting SS efforts to take away their humanity. As Anise Postel-Venet explains, and that was a woman in the French resistance, that, oh, you're testing. I thought you were waving at me. Sorry. She was a woman in the French resistance who became very, very close friends with the rabbits in the camp, and I was able to find her in Paris. All the women participated in a rescue of the rabbits towards the end of the camp. She was one of the ones that helped save them in the camp and helped them after the war. So as she explains, in a camp where cruelty dominates, the cruelest are kings. The women who suffer that, they become a bit cruel too, but not always, she said. In Ravensbruck, there were some exceptional people like the rabbits. I admired those girls because, first of all, I thought they were extremely brave. They were very organized for the camp's clandestine life. She added that she felt that the history of Poland had also prepared them, that the tricks to fight the occupier, they were passed down from father to son and from mother to daughter. It was like a habit for them, living a clandestine life and fighting against the occupier. Indeed, the Polish political prisoners seemed to be quite organized in their efforts in the camp. When the young girls from the Lublin-Warsaw transport arrived, the Polish camp veterans would sneak in to see the new arrivals, giving them crucial information about how to survive in the camp. Many of the organized Polish groups in the camp were scout-based, and the largest of these was known as the Walls. Their motto was to persevere and help others survive. Realizing that emotional support was crucial to survival, they focused on anonymous acts of kindness, providing help to those in need. I spoke with Kama Janowitz, the last living member of the Walls. She told me that just like any other scout, I would do what applied to each of us. It was to help others whenever possible. Sometimes the smallest thing was the most important, when we tried to help everyone of every nationality. It was Kama who pretended to be ill, a very dangerous thing to do, so she could gain access to the camp hospital and discover why the SS had secretly isolated the first group of young women in August of 1942. Once alerted, the Walls quickly mobilized, assigning members of the group to be mothers to the rabbits during their subsequent series of operations. These mothers were responsible, excuse me, These mothers were responsible for stealing food from the SS canteen and the kitchen as well for the most recent group of rabbits in the hospital. The prisoners, however, could do little to battle raging infections, and 5 of the young women died. Many more would have perished but for the help that the young rabbits gave each other, limping from cot to cot with bedpans or water, soothing those screaming in pain or delirious with fever, banging on a locked door to try and summon a nurse to help a dying friend, or in at least one instance, pleading successfully with the doctor not to give one woman a lethal injection. It's worth taking a moment to describe what was being done and why. The initial surgeries were an attempt to create warlike wounds in the legs of healthy young women and infect them with aggressive bacteria and materials like glass and wood chips. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, the personal physician to Himmler and Germany's senior doctor for the 1936 Olympics, was so highly respected that he was called in to take over care for Reinhard Heydrich, who was suffering wounds received in an assassination attempt. Gebhardt refused to use sulfa drugs, believing that they were useless against gas gangrene. Heydrich, one of the most important members of Hitler's inner circle, died from his wounds, and Hitler evidently blamed Gebhardt's decision for his loss. The experiments were then dreamed up by Himmler himself to repair the rift between the two. Consequently, the sulfa drug experiments on the women were purposely designed to fail. They later moved on to horrific surgeries involving nerves, bones, and muscles. The first 2 of the 6 rabbits that were executed in the camp were shot in early 1943, which was a turning point for the women. It was then that they began to develop into quite a formidable force of organized resistance, which became one of the most visible and well-known in the camp. They now resisted in 2 different ways, the first of which was open defiance. The next time the women from the Lublin-Warsaw transport were called up for surgeries, they refused to go. To support them, the rabbits, as a group, decided to fight back. After writing a letter of protest to the commandant and not getting a reply, they staged a protest to the front of the camp to personally deliver a petition to him, signed by all the rabbits, explaining that it was, staged a march to the front of the camp to personally deliver a petition to him, signed by all the rabbits, explaining that it was against international law to experiment on humans without their consent. But for Wanda Roshevitz, it was simpler than that. We just went to protest that either the operation stop or they should just shoot us. It was a horrific sight, according to the women, with all of them limping, leaning on one another, or even being carried. Survivor Joanna Pension remembers it as an extremely moving moment for her. They have their legs bandaged, and cannot walk properly, or were on crutches. When I close my eyes, I can see this march of invalids to the Vorn, to the commandant. This actually seemed to work at first, but a few months later, the SS called up another group for surgeries. Once again, these women flatly refused. Although they fled and with the help of other rabbits attempted to hide, they were eventually identified and forcibly dragged to the bunker. The SS conducted the surgeries anyway, but this time in an unsanitary prison in an incredibly brutal fashion. The other rabbits and women were severely punished and locked up several days in a hot barrack without food or water. When they were finally let out for roll call, many simply collapsed where they stood. Although this open defiance ultimately did not stop the surgeries, it did inspire others. 3 days after the March of the Invalids, the other Polish political prisoners followed their lead and marched in a protest because of a new round of executions. Some have described it as a near riot. Another survivor told me that she hadn't been in the camp for the protests, but that they all still whispered about it at night in the barracks. It was a powerful symbol of resistance and strength, and from very young, crippled girls. For the rabbits, there was a sense of finally controlling their own destiny. Wanda Roshevitz observed, "We had some small satisfaction that we could have gone to the commandant, that we could protest person to person, because, of course, we were not seen as human there. It built us up a little." In addition to openly defying the SS, they also began a secret campaign to let their family, and thus the Polish underground, know of the atrocities in the camp. In late 1942, Himmler began to allow some prisoners to receive food parcels from home. This gave Nina Avanska an idea. She and 3 of her fellow rabbits, including Wanda Potowska, decided to write secret notes in invisible ink on their censored correspondence to their families. These were short letters that they were allowed to send once a month. The food parcels could then serve as a way for their families to respond to these secret messages. Once they discovered that the system was working, they could communicate news of all the atrocities that were happening in the camp in real time, like the murder of newborns and the death transports to Auschwitz and other places for gassing. The system was also useful for smuggling in things. For example, wrapping food in pages of books that they wanted to read or hiding much-needed medications. You don't know this, but you will see, hopefully, fingers crossed. The medicine that Anise Postovanet received from Nina Avanska, which saved her life in the camp, was smuggled in through the food parcels. Although the girls hoped that these letters could be used as documentation for legal proceedings after the war, they were also trying to get the information broadcast on the radio to let the world know what was happening in the camp, hoping that this would force the SS to stop their criminal acts. Their efforts did indeed pay off and may have helped delay their execution date. Not only did the Polish government in exile receive the information, but they ensured that it was broadcast over an affiliate of the BBC. The broadcast mentioned the women, the experiments, and the death transports. The broadcast also warned the Germans, naming Commandant Sorin among others. "We are warning solemnly that if any mass murders are committed or if the vivisection experiments continue, they will be held responsible. These crimes will be avenged with a red-hot iron." The SS was furious and started conducting constant searches in the rabbits' barracks, believing that they had somehow secured and were hiding a radio transmitter. It seemed that the rabbits had succeeded in rattling the commandant to their great delight. It wasn't until February 4th, 1945, that Gebhardt, who had the most to lose from the rabbits surviving, ordered that the women be executed. The rabbits were to be killed the next morning. And then in Wanda Potofska's words, "Now there is a scene, thanks to God, that exists. There were 29 nationalities, and this evening prisoners of all nationalities suddenly agree to hide all the rabbits. The whole camp protects us." According to various sources, 5 or 6 women of various nationalities, French, Polish, and Norwegian, offered to die in their place. No rabbit would accept this offer. So the next day in pre-dawn hours, the rabbits lined up at roll call, united in their determination to resist at all costs. They would not go willingly to their executions. As Wanda Roshevitz described it, everyone was afraid, but we were militantly prepared. You can say we didn't want to be caught or give up, so we push, pull, beat, simply never give up, no giving up. And as the SS with their guns and dogs drew near, the Russian women who ran the camp electrical system shut out the lights. The other women had planned various diversions, which created mass chaos, and then the roll call lines closest to the rabbits fought to help them escape in the darkness. And with the support of the other prisoners, the rabbits hid all over the camp, in the medical block, under the barracks, in the rafters. And over the next weeks, the SS would set up surprise searches to try to find them. But with the women in the camp firmly behind them and the extreme disorder and overcrowding in the camp, they were unsuccessful. The commandant was certain that the rabbits would show up when they got hungry, but their fellow prisoners, who, by the way, were starving to death, made sure that the rabbits had food and water. And not one of the 63 of those young girls was betrayed. Eventually, some rabbits were smuggled onto transports to other camps, like Neustadt Gleva, or onto the Swedish buses that rescued many of the women from that camp. But many of them still had to leave camp on a death march at the end of April. I discovered that it was a small American troop which was on a mission behind enemy lines to try to establish communications with the Russians that first interrupted this death march, and their presence also liberated the nearby camp of Neustadt Gleva. The Germans assumed that these soldiers were the advance force of the American army and surrendered to them, saving many lives, including the rabbits. Elsewhere in Europe, other American soldiers, like my great-uncle, were liberating women's subcamps, whose prisoners many times had started their journey at Ravensbruck, the main clearinghouse for female labor. The collective resistance of the women in the camp ensured that the rabbits were able to serve as witnesses, living proofs of the German crimes and atrocities in the camp. Gebhardt's worst fear came true. 4 of the rabbits testified against him and the other camp doctors at the Nuremberg trials. He was sentenced to death. Although the commandant initially escaped, he was eventually caught and executed as well. Interestingly, Nino Vanska later provided evidence against a doctor that the U.S. had hired in the early 1950s as part of Operation Paperclip, a secret program which brought many Nazi criminals here to work for our government. As a result, he was fired and deported. I wish I had more time to tell you about all the different instances of resistance and compassion in the camp. I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface. But let me conclude with a quote from Wanda Potofska. "My generation survived the shock of finding out that man can become inhumane. And this discovery might have led to despair if it were not for the fact that those times also demonstrated that man can become, in some sense, superhuman, a hero. If he can become a monster, then he can also become a saint, and that is as true today as it was then." She told me that we are all capable of becoming like someone in the Gestapo or like the heroes in that camp. It is our choices each day that matter. I believe that is why my great-uncle wanted me to tell what he had seen with his 2 eyes. He didn't want us to forget what man can become and the horrors of which we are capable. He and Wanda and all the other survivors are trying to warn us, be aware, be conscious, and make the right choices before it is too late. I'm hoping that this film not only reminds us of that danger, but also of the great goodness, the hero within us all. And at the very least, I can say I have tried my best to fulfill the promise that I made to my great uncle on that cold night in Alabama so many years ago. Thank you. Can we watch the film? Will it work? Yes.
Wherever the German army went, they established systems of occupation.
You have to imagine Nazi Germany covered by a web of terror.
Resistance fighters from all these countries were brought to Ravensbruck.
The women arrived at the concentration camp,
Hitler's only all-female concentration camp.
the like of which they'd never seen before, and they still didn't really know what they were in for.
The Rabbits were Polish resistance fighters that were operated on at Ravensbrück concentration camp. The Nazis called them the Rabbits because they were their laboratory animals.
German doctors, educated, intelligent men, I'm sure they were kind to their cats and dogs, set up this program.
Their legs had been operated on to test the efficacy of sulfa drugs. The ones that survived afterwards hopped around the camp because their legs were violated so badly.
These arrogant men thought that women were of so little value that they could just chop up their bodies, brutalize their bodies, and then throw them out to be executed.
Nam doszło do 74 i były koleżanki, które po 5 razy miały operację.
The Rabbits had two main ideas as to how to stand up to these atrocities. One was to literally protest, and at the same time there was a plan to let the world know what was going on. They devised this idea of sending secret letters to their families back home in Lublin in invisible ink. There was an idea that if they could only get the information out to the outside world, they would stop it. And they were hoping that it would be used in evidence in war crimes after the end of the war. So they were absolutely diligent in the information they gave.
The relationship between the Polish women who had been experimented on and the French women started in the barracks. Nina Ivanska, one of the Rabbits, gave medicine that her father sent her to, and these postal Renee, and it saved her life.
Nina a vu que moi j'avais des abcès aux jambes et grâce à elle, mes jambes ont pu guérir et moi aussi, j'ai pu remarcher.
There was this camaraderie that also developed amongst all the nationalities.
Współdziałanie to był pewien rodzaj walki o być, o żyć.
The Allies were advancing, and this kind of chaotic desire to destroy evidence had already started happening. The SS were aware that these experiments were a war crime of a special nature. This really was going to be the last chance for the SS to execute the Rabbits.
Któregoś dnia wyszedł rozkaz rozstrzelania nas.
The torture and the suffering and the degradation that was imposed on the Rabbits produced a solidarity amongst the rest of the prisoners that was unheard of. They were prepared to sacrifice their own safety for these women. This extraordinary system was arranged almost in a matter of hours.
Idzie gromada Niemców, SS-manów, z karabinami w ręku, z przygotowanymi do strzałów, tak jak idzie się powiedzmy na bój.
À ce moment-là, la solidarité était totale. Ces filles étaient menacées de mort, il fallait absolument faire quelque chose.
bo przyjaźń ma ogromną wartość, proszę mi wierzyć.
Thank you.